In the late spring of 1932, a group of desperate men gathered in the dusty interior of Western Australia to discuss a threat that the government seemed unable to quantify. These were not career agitators, but rather veteran soldiers who had been given plots of marginal land as a reward for their service in the First World War. They had survived the mud of the Somme and the horrors of Gallipoli, only to find themselves facing a slow, creeping ruin on the edge of the desert. Their enemy was not an invading human army, but a force of 20,000 emus that had emerged from the wilderness to descend upon their wheat fields. The birds were not simply eating the crops, they were destroying the very infrastructure of the farms, tearing holes in fences that allowed rabbits to flood in and finish what the birds had started. The farmers did not ask for subsidies or agricultural experts, but for the one thing they knew could solve a problem of this scale. They requested the deployment of the Australian military, specifically armed with machine guns. It was a request that reached the desk of Sir George Pearce, the Minister of Defense, who saw in this crisis a unique opportunity. The Great Depression had cast a long shadow over the nation, and a successful military operation against a biological nuisance offered a chance for a public relations victory. He agreed to send a small unit of the Royal Australian Artillery, equipped with 2 Lewis light machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, under the command of Major G.P.W. Meredith. When the soldiers arrived in the district of Campion, they carried with them the absolute certainty of men who possessed the pinnacle of modern firepower. The Lewis gun was a weapon of devastating efficiency, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute and cutting through infantry lines with ease. To the soldiers, the mission appeared to be little more than a controlled cull, a task that would be completed in a few days of target practice. They expected the emus to behave like a traditional herd, bunching together in fear and providing a static target for the gunners. However, as the first group of birds was sighted near a local fence line, the soldiers encountered a biological reality that their training had never prepared them for. As soon as the first bursts of fire echoed across the plain, the emu population did not collapse into a panicked mass. Instead, the birds seemed to instantly grasp the geometry of the threat. They split into small, independent cells, sprinting in different directions at speeds that made it impossible for the gunners to track them. The soldiers found that while the Lewis gun was effective against a stationary line of men, it was remarkably difficult to aim at a target moving 40 miles per hour across uneven ground. By the end of the first day, despite thousands of rounds being fired, only a handful of birds lay dead in the scrub. The soldiers were left standing in a cloud of red dust, staring at a horizon where the enemy had simply vanished. The failure of the first encounter led the military to reconsider their tactics, yet each new strategy seemed to reveal a further layer of the emu's resilience. Major Meredith began to notice a pattern in the way the birds organized themselves during these skirmishes. In every large flock, there appeared to be a dominant, dark-plumaged male that acted as a sentinel. While the other birds fed or rested, this individual would stand perfectly still, scanning the horizon for the slightest glint of sunlight on a gun barrel. At his signal, the flock would disperse before the soldiers could even get within range. This was not the behavior of a simple animal, but a decentralized defensive strategy that allowed the birds to nullify the advantage of long-range weaponry. The frustration of the troops grew as they realized that the emus were nearly impossible to kill with a single shot. The birds possessed a thick layer of feathers and a physiological structure that allowed them to sustain multiple hits and continue running. Major Meredith famously remarked that if he had a division of men with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, he could face any army in the world. This was not hyperbole, but a genuine expression of awe at a creature that could be riddled with high-velocity lead and still outpace a military vehicle. The soldiers were witnessing a form of natural armor that made their industrial tools of death feel obsolete. As the body count remained embarrassingly low, the military attempted one final, desperate maneuver to regain the upper hand. They decided to mount one of the machine guns onto the back of a truck, hoping to use the vehicle's speed to chase down the flocks and fire on the move. It was a strategy born of pure desperation, and it failed almost immediately. The rugged terrain of the outback was never meant for a motorized pursuit, and the bouncing of the truck made the machine gun completely uncontrollable. In the end, the truck collided with a fence, and the soldiers watched as the emus easily navigated the obstacles that had crippled the machine. The technological superiority of the Australian army had been defeated by the sheer simplicity of the Australian landscape. While the campaign continued in the desert, a different kind of battle was being fought in the Australian Parliament. News of the military's struggle had reached the cities, and the initial curiosity had turned into a wave of public ridicule. Opposition members began to ask if the soldiers would be awarded campaign medals for their service against the birds, and if the government intended to hold a formal surrender ceremony with the emu leaders. The international press picked up the story, and the British Empire's military prestige was suddenly being mocked by newspapers across the globe. The image of professional soldiers being outmaneuvered by flightless birds was a humiliation that the administration could no longer afford to ignore. In a move to save face, the government ordered the immediate withdrawal of the troops, declaring that the mission had achieved its objectives despite the evidence to the contrary. The machine guns were packed away, the soldiers were sent back to their barracks, and the farmers were left exactly where they had started. The emus remained in the wheat belt, their numbers largely undiminished, and their presence now a symbol of a government's hubris. It was a quiet end to a conflict that had promised a swift victory, leaving behind nothing but empty shells and a profound sense of failure. The aftermath of the Great Emu War forced a complete reassessment of how the state interacted with the environment. The government eventually realized that the military was the wrong tool for an ecological problem. They shifted their strategy toward a bounty system, offering money to the farmers for every emu they killed themselves. This proved far more effective than the machine guns, as the farmers were motivated by survival and possessed a deep, localized knowledge of the birds' habits. Within a few years, hundreds of thousands of birds were culled by the very men who had originally begged for the army's help. The story of the army that lost to birds is often told as a comedy of errors, yet it contains a much darker reflection on the limits of human power. The soldiers arrived in the outback with the belief that nature was a series of problems to be solved with force, only to find that nature is a system that operates on its own set of rules. The emus did not win because they were smarter or more aggressive, but because they were perfectly adapted to a world where the machine gun was an alien and ineffective intruder. They did not need to understand the war to win it. They only needed to exist. As the years passed, the Australian government invested millions in the construction of the state barrier fence, a massive structure designed to keep the emus and other pests away from the fertile agricultural lands. These fences, stretching for thousands of miles, represent a silent acknowledgement of the bird's victory. We no longer attempt to conquer the emu through open warfare. Instead, we have built walls to define our separate territories. The conflict ended not with a peace treaty, but with a realization that there are some forces in the natural world that cannot be broken, only managed. The memory of the 1932 campaign remains as a monument to the moment when a modern nation-state tried to bend the desert to its will, and the desert simply refused to move. Today, the emu stands prominently on the Australian coat of arms, a symbol of a nation that supposedly only moves forward. There is a poetic irony in this placement, considering the bird earned its place not by being conquered, but by being insurmountable. While we often view history as a record of human ingenuity and control, the Great Emu War remains a fracture in that narrative.